I'm here with John Nolan, Vice President of Compliance here at ISI. The focus of our conversation today is for defense contractors. We're seeing a lot of primes start to roll out their own guidance on CMMC in regards to timelines, right? We're seeing people submit timelines for people to be certified by a certain date or to start reporting on progress there. And so, John, I just wanted to turn it over to you to ask. What's the rationale for primes moving ahead of this phase rollout schedule?
Yeah, I mean it's pretty logical if you think about it. We hear that, this November date for the phase two rollout, and we all kind of expect that to be when the requirements apply. But the truth is that's when the government is implementing those requirements. That's when everybody has to be ready, to prove that to the government. So the primes obviously will have to prove their supply chain at that time as well. And they don't want to be doing that the day of. So what we're seeing is at least some measure of proof might not be the right word, but some measure of progress, some measure of certification that primes are looking for to make sure all their ducks are in a row before the government asks them for the information or confirmation rather. Usually that's coming in the form of a level two self-attestation. Long term, we don't think that those are going to be used for very much, but we're seeing right now that they're being used as stopgaps. We know there's a big backlog for C3PAOs. We know things like that are coming up. So, it really is about making sure they have everything they need when the time comes.
And I think that's a great point about like the stopgap measure, right? Because I think what gets lost in the conversation is that you can be ready for an assessment, but that doesn't mean you're going to get an assessment right there,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and so piggybacking off that, we saw one of the notices come out from a major prime
Hmm.
that basically said we need at least this section of our supply chain to be certified by July 30th, 2026. Correct me if I'm wrong on that date.
Right.
That's 6 months ahead, basically, of the phase rollout schedule. I wanted to
Yeah.
get your perspective, especially with, your work with contractors on the assessment sort of cycle, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Well, I
How,
mean,
yeah, go
it,
ahead.
it's really been all about understanding the differences because what we're seeing a lot of people do is freaking out right away because they're saying CMMC level two. They know they can't. C3PAOs are booking out. There are some that can book you right away, but by and large, it's 3 months out or more. And especially those folks who haven't really done a lot to get ready yet are freaking out. And I want to be clear that the self-attestation, you need to be ready for an assessment to self-attest. You need to be sure and have the evidence that you are level two. It's not something you can just check as a waiting game. But knowing that they're not going to be able to get all their subs through a C3PAO accreditation, they need to at least have something, I'll say legal in writing saying that,
Right.
hey, we know this is here. We have done everything that we're supposed to do to be ready for it. And we're attesting to that. And then the C3PAO certifications are coming shortly behind that. And I think that's another good point for people to realize is that the self-attestation, in my mind at least, should only be what you do now. It shouldn't be something where you're like, well, we guess we don't need that C3PAO certification because we're already certified. There's a massive difference in the long run between self-attestation and C3PAO certification.
Yeah, no, and I think sort of like to your point of needing that proof,
Right.
right? We're not talking about the self-attestation that led to the CMMC program. We're talking about a much more rigorous process to
Yeah.
make sure that your documentation, your evidence that you're putting forward is defensible.
That's right. And I think that's a very important thing. I don't think anybody is really out there maliciously trying to get around the system, but let's be honest, for years and years and years, we've been conditioned to think a checkbox is okay and nobody's going to ask about it. So we want to completely trash that mentality here and now. One of the ways that they're doing that is they've made the check boxes, for what it's worth, they've made the check boxes for the self-attestation more granular. So you're not just going in and saying, yep, I'm level two. You have to go through and check off every single control that you've met. So, that is you, or rather, you're the forgetting the name of it now. The attestation person, the accountable person for what's being put
The
in there.
affirming official, yeah.
There you go. The affirming official is tied to the met not met for each of those controls and would have to answer to them if questioned. So it's really important for people to realize what they're agreeing to and what they're attesting to when they're putting their name on that and making sure it is in place.
And so, I wanted to go back to, one of the notices we sort of all got wind of in the industry was this July 30, 2026 for, at least a section of their supply chain.
Hmm.
It's kind of a twofold question of, I think we can see the rationale behind it,
Hmm.
but like, how realistic is that for a pretty sizable portion of an entire supply chain in the next, today, 2 months or whatever it is to turn that around?
Well, I mean, it all really depends on how seriously the supply chain has been taking it and how
Fair.
well the requirement has been communicated. Because I don't want to put it all on the supply chain being ready. Certainly, we've seen, I sit in a seat that gives me a pretty interesting look at, the ecosystem response to how real this thing is. And over the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen a surprising percentage of companies repeatedly say, "Oh, it's not going to happen for XYZ reasons," and that those reasons have adjusted. But um, you know, more, I would say, the majority are taking it very seriously now. But if the supply chain isn't aware that they're going to have to meet these requirements, if they haven't started, or I don't even want to say started at this point. I want to say if they're not knee deep in the process, that makes that July date extremely hard to meet. Just because the majority, doing this in specifically in CMMC for the last 6 years, I have come across approximately five government contractors that were in a, let's say, 80% implementation point. Most need to have something major done, like an environmental migration where they're getting into a compliant environment from a standard commercial environment. And these things take a lot of time. The documentation is a weeks long project in itself if it's done right. So there's a lot to it. I would say, depending on the numbers, of who has taken the steps versus who is just finding out or just realizing that they actually have to do it, really makes all the difference in whether that's attainable or not.
And I keep coming back to, these notices largely. There were some that came out
Mhm.
sort of last year. There's a handful of, large prime contractors that have been truly amazing at like
Right.
updating their supply chain on what's going on and setting very clear expectations. But we've
Hmm.
seen more kind of come into that really heavy communication style this year. And as great as that is, there is that timeline
Right.
people need to hit, right? And
Yes.
so let's say you're kind of a contractor who, for all intents and purposes, was doing it the right way,
Hmm.
was following up and attending webinars or events in the industry, kept hearing about this phase rollout strategy or timeline, and had them mapped out on the calendar and was working from that. And then they get this supply chain letter that's like, hey, we might be bumping that up. What
Yeah, I
advice would you
mean,
give to somebody in that situation?
do you want the hardliner advice or the regular advice?
I'll take
So,
both depending on what you're willing to give.
yeah. So I mean, the hardliner advice or statement, I should say, is, and I really hate when I hear this said in like webinars and at conferences, but they'll say that these things were supposed to be implemented since 2019, and CMMC is only the requirement to be assessed against them, not to have them in place. So I'd say anybody that doesn't have them in place, whether they were told directly by their contractor or not that they needed to have them, still kind of falls onto them. But I personally, well, let me say realistically, we all go by what we're told, what we're said, and we may have the time to dig into these things, and it can even be argued that we should make the time to dig into these things. But realistically, I think a lot of people in the industry are wearing a lot of hats, and they're kind of relying on what they're being told. So there has to be some responsibility to the prime to get that information out clearly and consistently to their supply chain.
Yeah, can't let sins of the past derail the
Right. Yeah.
derail the new system. And for, sort of the other side of that, right? Of, if you're hearing this now and you were going by the phase rollout timeline, is there something or anything you'd suggest they do with that prime of just sort of like is it, I guess my question is it okay for them to reach out and just be like, hey, we're working towards this, but July, June, we might not be done yet. Like, is that a good step for them to take?
I think it is. I think, as long as they've done everything they can, and they have, their all the intentions are not only good but provable. I think that's, an acceptable thing. Let's remember that the main thing that the primes are doing right now ahead of this November date is just making sure they don't have a mess right before they have to
Right.
implement everything. Now, if everybody starts doing this, it probably won't be acceptable. But I've had great success in the past with something as simple as a letter of engagement. Explaining to the prime that, hey, from our side, we would say we're engaged with XYZ client. We're doing all of these steps will be done by this date, and here's what's going out. But I think really they just need the assurance that it's going to be there. That's not global. I think there's some that just really want everything in place by July, so you can't take that for everywhere. But I do think that there are considerations that primes will take. I think that if you're able to convince them that you're genuine and you're on your way there and just need a little bit more time, it won't be a major problem. That being said, it's hyper dependent on the prime, and it's also hyper dependent on something that I've always been surprised about in the DoD DOW ecosystem is that people seem really hesitant to reach out to their contract administrators, and I think I get it. I totally do. I mean, you don't want to be the squeaky wheel if you're up for a rebid. A lot of these contractors just want to not fly under the radar, but they don't want to rock the boat at all and risk
Sure.
being a problem sub. But I think, that's something we kind of got to get over on both sides, and that communication path needs to be clear and not intimidating for the subs so they can get the clear information they need.
I think it's a great point, right? Of like this, it's an odd period for both primes and
Yeah.
subcontractors to where it's like, yes, the standards have been there, but the validation is different. And there's
Hmm.
this awkward, according to the government, 3-year period to where
Right.
some conversations are going to be had, but that doesn't mean not to have the conversation. Um,
100%.
I think
Yeah.
both sides are going to come from it from a pretty agreeable angle when they can, you know.
Yeah, I think the old adage, more flies with honey than vinegar always serves. If you're reaching out to your contract administrator with a genuine concern or question, and you're coming at it from a place of wanting to do what's right and hit the rules and do what they need, then I don't think you have anything to really worry about. That's not, again, a universal truth, but I think it fits most.
Yeah. And to be clear, right, not every notice that's going out is this hard deadline for certification.
Yeah.
Some of it is that milestone thing. And, from what I hear from you, be honest where you're at, and treat it as we're here, but here's our plan to get to, X, and we're going to be by Y by this point and Z by that point.
Right. Yeah, no, I think being honest and upfront about where you're at is a big thing. I mean, let's be real, there's a large percentage that just isn't where they should be right now. But it's understanding that you are pushing and you do get the gravity of the situation, you do get the importance of what's happening, and you're pushing to get there. That's what they want to know. They don't want to be at November 9th and have, 30% of their subs saying, well, we might go this way or we might go that way. We could, by end of year, definitely, we'll have it done. That's what they're trying to avoid. So I think as long as you have your path and you can prove that path, you should be fine.
And, I think the conversation sort of thus far between you and I has
Hmm.
kind of focused on that subcontractor
Yeah.
um, company to where it makes total sense. Um, but we're also talking a lot about what the large primes are doing. And so let's just
Hmm.
shift for 1 second to sort of that make up a lot of the DIB, those small to medium sized prime contractors that
Right.
have a supply chain. Sure, it's not 8,000 subs or whatever it is, but they have, 10, 20,
All it
maybe.
takes is one. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If they haven't started doing that communication,
Hmm.
should they start doing it right now with
Oh
this
yeah,
supply chain?
they should start doing it yesterday, really. I mean, because everything I said about the subs really applies to the primes as well, just from the opposite side. The first thing you need to do is evaluate all of your subs and determine on a realistic level whether the flow down should go to them, whether they're storing, processing, or transmitting CUI or involved in that process at all. Um, Take a hard look at it from top to bottom, understand if they get only FCI, if they're getting CUI as well, if they're working on your systems or their systems, all of that needs to be fully understood. And then you need to start communicating down. And honestly, I would, as a prime, I would take, the path that's been laid by the bigger primes and request that early and clearly and often, consistently, I'll say, because you also don't want to be caught at the last minute with 10 different primes that are scrambling to get something together for you, and risk your contract as a whole.
And I think that's an important call out for that group, right?
Right.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think from my understanding, the prime doesn't necessarily need their subs to be certified at the moment they win their award. But the whole rationale of getting this verified early is that when they win that award, they're able to deliver on time. Is that sort of the
Yeah, I'd
mindset
say
prime should take on?
I'd say that's accurate. Yeah. I mean, again, all of this is going to be contract dependent. But yeah, absolutely. If assuming that you have that requirement. Yep.
Awesome. Well, John, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I think this is super insightful. Any last second thoughts or anything on the topic at hand?
No, I just say, if you haven't spoken to your prime about it as a sub, then do that right away. And if you're a prime who hasn't talked down to your subs yet, same deal. Do that right away so everybody's on the same page and we know what's expected.
Awesome. Well, we'll wrap up there. Hopefully this is helpful and keep an eye out for the next video between me and John where we're talking about something that pops up in the near future in the DIB. Thanks,
Right.
everybody.
Thank you.